My name is Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester. And unlike many academics, actually I have an industrial background. I was brought up living next door to a nuclear power station in the UK, and my dad worked at the nuclear power station. So I was interested in issues of energy and issues of the environment from a very early age. I left school quite early. I left school at 16. I worked in the Merchant Navy. I did what we call an apprenticeship. So I did some training as a marine engineer on ships, on tankers, on container ships, and large ships traveling around the world. I then later went back to university and did a mechanical engineering degree. And then after that, I went to work in the oil industry, and I was a design engineer designing new offshore oil platforms. And then I worked offshore, building and constructing those platforms and getting them to a position where we could hand them to the operators to produce oil and gas from the North Sea in the UK. During that time, I got increasingly interested in issues of climate change because I always had this interest in energy and the environment. Climate change was coming to the fore in the late 80s, early 90s. So I decided to go back to university to learn a little bit more about climate change, a little bit more about economics, to go with my engineering, a bit more about biology. And I then just stayed on to do a PhD, and I gradually evolved to become an academic. But I very much have an industrial background, and that means that I look at things perhaps in a different way to many traditional academics in universities who often came to university straight from school and have never left that sort of environment. For me, working on climate change is not just an academic job. It's actually it also influences how I live my own life. I don't think I could live my life in a way that is not at least informed by what my own research is telling me and research of other colleagues. But that is actually not easy. When I look at climate change issues today, I'm left with no doubt that we face an enormous challenge in trying to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. And primarily to reduce those emissions in the short term means that we have to reduce the amount of energy we consume. But the important thing there is, who is the we? It is not the poor people around the world. It's not even the poor people in the UK, or even maybe sometimes the average person. Most of the emissions from the globe come from a small percentage of the population. 10% of the global population is responsible for 50% of all global emissions. So I'm left thinking, well, I'm in that 10%. What do I do? And now, clearly, I've got a long, long way to go to reduce my emissions to any level that would be necessary for me to make a fair contribution to this 2 degrees C characterization of avoiding dangerous climate change. Nevertheless, I've tried to do some things in my own life, and I try to encourage that with my colleagues, my friends, my family, and so forth. The big thing, I think, for me, and it has proved very difficult, but I've managed to maintain it, is to not fly. So I have not been on an aircraft now for, I think it's 11 years. That is difficult from a work point of view, but certainly not impossible. I do travel still across Europe quite a lot. That is always by train. I also travel sometimes to other parts of the world, but that is normally by either train or by ship. It takes much longer. But again, I think, well, during that time when I'm away, I can actually work. So I always work when I'm away. So I try to make the most of my travel, but that requires more planning. But away from work, that's where it's more difficult, I think. I don't have a very large family. Most of my family, unfortunately, have already died. But there are some members of my family who are still alive. I particularly have a very close uncle who I'm very fond of, who lives in Australia. He's quite old now. He cannot come over here. And I know I will never see him again. That is not easy. That is a difficult thing, and I'm reminded of it regularly. But if I chose to go and see him, I have to then justify why I think my carbon emissions, which would be very high to fly to see him in Australia, those carbon emissions will affect some poor people living on the coastal strip of Bangladesh, some other poor people in other parts of the world who will be impacted by climate change. So I have to think that somehow it is better for me to go and see my uncle and them to suffer the repercussions, or for them not to suffer the repercussions of my carbon emissions, and I do not see my uncle. And I've chosen the latter of those. That has not been easy. And also with my friends, a lot of those I'm a keen rock climber, and they regularly fly away for 1 week rock climbing, sometimes just a few days to Spain or to Italy, because the weather is good in Spain or Italy and not in the UK. I can't join them. I find it also quite difficult that they do this. So that has caused some tensions and some good discussions. Away from aviation, I drive probably only 1/3 of the distance that I drove 10 years ago each year. So I've cut back on my driving. I tend to use public transport a lot more than I have done previously, and thoroughly enjoy using it. It's not difficult to do that. You get used to using public transport. This is very easy. I try to avoid using taxis. So today when I came to the European Parliament, I just walked from the station. It just took me half an hour. With modern communication, you can have a map. It is easy to follow the map. I have moved house from what was not a very big house, but a reasonable sized terraced house in the UK. I've moved to a 2-bedroom flat, which is a lovely flat. It's a very nice place to live, but it's much smaller. It's still a good size, but it's much smaller than my old terrace house. And my energy bills are probably 1/4. So the amount of energy I use is about 1/4 of the average small house in the UK. So they're the sorts of things that I've tried to do. I'm careful when I buy something to try to buy something that is efficient. And I try to make sure I live a reasonably low carbon life in that I switch things off. I'm careful what I buy. I do not throw lots of things away that I can still use. They're the sorts of things that I do, but they are still not enough. There are many thousands of people many millions of people, I would think, in the UK who still have lower emissions than me. They are mostly the poorer people. Amongst people who have the same sort of income that I have, I'm probably a very low emitter. But we have to remind ourselves that the people who are really low emitters in the world are generally those who do not use a lot of energy and do not have a lot of income. So they're the sorts of things that I've tried to do. Oh, and I am a vegetarian. I forgot to mention that. And that is primarily for environmental and some climate change reasons, but also to do with animal welfare as well. If I had the power to adjust modern society so that it could deliver on this 2 degrees C framing of climate change, to me there would be 2 very clear phases to deliver on that. The first of these would be that we must dramatically reduce our energy consumption today. And that is because most of our energy around the world is provided by fossil fuels. So if we reduce the amount of energy we consume, we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere. Now, I'm not saying this would be easy, but certainly it would be doable. It would be possible to deliver those sorts of changes in the energy we consume. And they could be done by 2 principal mechanisms. One of these would be changes in how we live our lives. And when I say, again, the we in this, those of us who generally are high energy consumers anyway. So the types of behaviors that we have, the routines that we have, the habits that we have, the things that we have normalized in our life that are now very high energy consumption. But also, behaviorally, we would start to have to look at different sorts of technologies, or often just the same technology, but more efficient versions. So I personally would ensure that we would use lots of standards. Politicians would be required to set emission standards that would set the level of maximum carbon dioxide emissions for a car, for instance. Now, the EU already has a standard like this, but it's very weak indeed. So it would have to be much tighter. You would do the same with IT appliances, with refrigerators, with many of the things that we use in our lives that consume lots of energy. So these would now only be allowed to be sold if they were very efficient. And if you put those 2 together, those 2 bits there, one, the behavioral changes in how we live our lives, and put that with the efficiency of the appliances that we buy and then use, that would make a big difference in our energy demand. There is a really important thing we have to think about here, though. The first thing we would normally do if we reduce our energy demand on some things is that we spend the money that we have saved on some other activity which would have a lot more energy in it again. This is called the rebound effect, or Jevons paradox. And so we have to have policies that would ensure that any money that we saved was not be spent on something that was more energy consuming. One of the ways you might do this in terms of policymakers is to think about what are the tools that you have. I quite like the idea of progressive metering tariffs for things like electricity. So the first set of units of electricity you use in your house would be at a certain price that could be very low to help poorer people. The next set of electricity that you use, the next number of kilowatt hours, would be at a higher price. The next would be at a higher price again. So if you're in a big house consuming lots more energy, you will have to pay lots more money for each unit of energy of the big consumption that you have. This would help a lot with equity, because one of the big problems, I think, in climate change is that we can put in place policies that affect all of us, but the poor people suffer more than the wealthy. People like me are inelastic to the price of energy. If the price of energy goes up, I can just afford to pay it. So there has to be ways to stop me from doing that. But to go along with these behavioral changes and these technical changes on the demand side, we also need to have what I've referred to as a Marshall-style plan for building low-carbon energy supply. That means we need to be making a very rapid transition towards low and ideally zero carbon energy. Now that is not, with electricity, that is a little bit easier. But electricity is only 20% of the energy we consume in most industrialized countries. So 80% of the energy we consume in our countries is normally not electricity. So we have to think about how would we decarbonize those sectors. And the main way of doing that is to make those electric as well. So you have to think about having electric vehicles, and we have to think about electric heating and obviously air conditioning, using more electricity in industry. So trying to say that rather than being 20% of the energy we consume, electricity needs to provide perhaps 80% of the energy we consume. That will mean we have to build a much larger grid, the infrastructure, the wires, the cables, more power stations that need to be, again, low carbon. We have problems there that a lot of the low carbon ones have some levels of intermittency. They're not all, for instance, we always hear the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining, certainly not in the UK. Now, these problems are exaggerated. They are not as big as many people suggest, but they are still important technical issues. So I think we also have to think, how do we modify society so that it can sometimes adjust its demand to match the supply if the supply is a bit more intermittent? We need to have smarter energy systems. Now, there are lots of technologies we can use here. There are lots of ways that we can price things that can help with this. If you put all of this together, I think we could reduce emissions just about in line with the 2 degrees C framing of climate change. But there are huge requirements here, both for policymakers to engage and for citizens. So it's not all about a top-down approach, and it's not all about a bottom-up approach. We definitely need people to be having what we call decentralized electricity and to be thinking about their own energy consumption. But we also need policymakers to think about large offshore wind turbines, carbon capture and storage. And some people may even argue that we may have to think about nuclear power, because whatever the problems, it is certainly low carbon. There are lots of other issues with it as well. So we have to think, what are the options there for the policymakers? What are the options for the public? And it has to be a partnership. But if we're not serious about this, if we're not prepared to make these sorts of changes very rapidly indeed, then we are handing on to our children a future of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade rise across the century. We are handing on to them, as the International Energy Agency have already suggested, a planet that would have devastating consequences because of our lack of courage and action today. We are not short of technology. We are not short of the ideas. What we are short of is the courage to put those in place. So that is the way that I would frame the climate change problem. There are lots of other issues in there. I'm just trying to provide an outline here. So there'd be lots more detail that we'd have to look at country by country. But that gives a broad outline of how we could hold to a 2 degrees C framing of climate change. If we are not prepared to make rapid and deep reductions in our emissions today, and I've already emphasized who the "our" is in this, the "we," it's say that small group of high emitters. If we fail on this, and that is looking increasingly likely, then we're almost certainly going to have temperatures go up well above 2 degrees centigrade, maybe 3, 4, and it could, of course, keep going up well above that if we get these natural feedbacks kicking in as well. So one of the options that some people have been talking about, and I think have been dangerously talking about because they've been talking about it quietly, is what has been called geoengineering. And there are lots of technologies behind this. the two principal techniques for geoengineering, one of them is to reflect sunlight back out into space to stop all of the sun's heat arriving on the Earth. And there are lots of technologies for doing this that they are talking about. These are all very speculative. I often call them Dr. Strangelove technologies after the famous film, Peter Sellers film from many years ago. They are not well understood. They are potentially very dangerous, and they do not solve the problem of our carbon dioxide emissions keep going up. But these techniques for reflecting the sunlight, which are often referred to as insolation, are things like firing rockets into the stratosphere and putting sulfate particles, which we have been trying to remove from the atmosphere for the last 100 years, putting these actually in the stratosphere, and these reflect sunlight back into space. Or to vaporize sometimes just a small amount of seawater that has what we call cloud condensation nuclei, small particles of salt really, that clouds would form around, and these clouds will act, or may act, as a blanket reflecting the sunlight back out into space. But there are many other techniques we can use to reflect the sunlight out. The problem with this is that firstly, we don't know how it would work. It would have lots of unknown repercussions. If we switched it off and we had not solved the climate problem underneath it, then we would see a very rapid spike in the temperature. So it would be used as an excuse to let us keep on burning fossil fuels. So there are very many problems with it. Nevertheless, I think it is something we may have to carry on doing some research on. But as with the other technique, which is carbon sequestration, ways of sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which does try to solve the problem at least, but both of these are very speculative. The ways to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the most common one is referred to as BECCS, which is biomass, energy, carbon capture and storage, where we will grow large swathes of the planet about the area of 1 to 3 times the size of India. We would plant it with trees or with crops. We would harvest those crops every year. We would convert it into a useful form of energy that we could then transport to power stations all around the globe. We would then burn it, that biomass, bioenergy in power stations. We would capture the carbon dioxide. We would liquefy it. Then we would store it somewhere underground for 1,000 or more years. We'd have to do this year after year after year for 50 or so years. Now, this seems to me, there are lots of technical problems with this. We would also have to feed 9 billion people at the same time. It would be very inefficient. It would require huge numbers of ships. We don't know if there's enough storage place for all of this carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide mustn't leak. It'll be very expensive if it did work at all. And also it will not work in time to stop some of the natural feedbacks. So from both of these geoengineering options, although I think we need to research them, they are very unlikely to work in any way that would be help us at any significant level. So we must assume that they do not work. They will not work. They are very unlikely to work. Maybe a 5% chance, perhaps even less, and probably too late. But because we have chosen to do nothing about climate change so far, because we've made that choice, when we look at our children, when we have breakfast with them, when we look at other people working around us, we are making that choice that we do not care about the future. And if we're going to carry on with that choice, then we may have to think about some of these other options, which will anyway probably not work. But we are in a very difficult position. We expect that we're going to solve climate change by doing nothing now and having a speculative technology in 50 years' time that might save the day for us, and it probably will not. So ultimately it comes back to the fact is, if we do really love the place that we live, if we do love our family, if we do love our children, if we do care about our neighbours and other people around the world, then we have to make radical, deep reductions in our emissions now. We cannot rely on engineers and scientists for miracle solutions in 50 years' time.